I like that kind of story, it's somebody who is doing what she can do in the circumstances to make things better. There was a man named Carl Clifton Booth who grew up in Texas in the 1890s. He was a small boy when his Protestant pastor started scolding the congregation because they were behind in the payments they had promised to make to him. And he was going to hold a special fundraiser the next Sunday, and he wanted his wages brought up to date. Well, Carl was conscientious and he wanted to help, so he scoured the alleys in the town where he lived, and he found 8 perfect whiskey bottles, which he took to a bartender and sold them. He had 8 pennies that he tied up in his handkerchief and took them to the special collection. The sermon didn't go as he expected, though. The preacher told him that he didn't worship a dime and nickel God, and he would not settle for dimes and nickels in payment. Carl said he never even mentioned pennies. He ran from the church and threw away his handkerchief with the pennies in it, and he vowed that someday he would find a church that did not take up collections. He lived quite a life. He became a mercenary. He was in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. He was in China during the Boxer Rebellion. He had part of his nose cut off in a knife fight. He was shot a couple of times, and then he returned to Texas. Just as tough as he had ever been, he became a policeman and a parole officer and got a face full of buckshot when someone he was trying to arrest had a family member who did not approve. And he just was as hard and as tough as anybody that ever came out of Texas. He also found the church and was baptized. He became a real estate man. He owned several houses that he rented to Black families on the west side of the Trinity River. He would cross the river every week to collect his rents. And as he did, this is getting into the 30s, as he did, he started realizing that what we'd call them homeless camps on that side of the river were growing. There were so many people who had been displaced because of the Dust Bowl and the Depression and so on. And they were living in shanties built of cardboard and pieces of metal taken from the dump. One time he spotted a child who was crying, and he stopped to find out what was wrong, and the child was hungry. So Carl went to a grocery store and he brought back food for that family, and he never went back to that side of the river without carrying food in his car, and he always found somebody who needed something. He and another man in the Dallas ward, Dallas branch, I guess they were still at that point, decided they needed to do something for these people. They were living without education and without religion, and that was something that Carl thought he could do something about. So he organized a Sunday school on that side of the river with the help of other branch members. They kept minutes the same as every Sunday school in the church has always done up till the 70s. But the minutes of that branch always have something that's a little bit different than I've ever seen in any other set of minutes. Gave away 4 new blankets and a new quilt. Distributed 20 pairs of shoes. Every week they did what they could to help these people, and it was just purely voluntary effort. There was not an assignment. It was just, they did what they could. It took 6 years, but Carl Clifton Booth managed to raise the money and build a chapel, a regular chapel with a steeple and an organ and windows and things that they didn't have in that camp. And the church formally organized a branch that they called him to be the branch president at. A few years later, they added some classrooms and a kitchen, and he estimated that within 5 years they had baptized 150 people and that they had blessed about 800 babies. That was just one man with the help of his friends doing what needed to be done to help. And some of our stories, admittedly, are not as wholesome as the ones that I've just told. We have stories of violence and racism and mistreatment of women. There's no shortage of historical research and scholarship devoted to uncovering those stories. And I don't shy away from telling those stories. I've told some pretty horrendous things on my blog. But one difference between the stories that I tell and some of what scholars do is that I'm looking for the individuals involved, not just the overall story. I mean, it's an easy thing to say Mormons are racist, and you can prove it with this letter and that speech and these statistics, but I want to get to know the individuals. What effect did this sort of thing have on their lives? Both those who perpetuated racism and those who suffered the consequences. The first really good story that I found that fits into that category was a letter written by a woman who lived in Oakland, California. She and her husband had been members of the church for almost 10 years when they took a trip back to Atlanta. And she had friends there that she wanted to take to church. So she took two girlfriends and they went to the chapel in Atlanta, and they took seats in the back. And she says in her letter, she said it was like it was a den of dark spirits. We found the right church, but we found the wrong people. They were asked to leave because they were told this church had been built by the white saints, for the white saints. And as she put it, we was colored. She was so upset by that. She said, I thought the gospel was free to all who wanted it, that she wrote a letter to President Grant thinking that he would like to know this so that he could do something about it. She said it would not affect her testimony. The Lord had always been good to her, and that had not changed and would not change. That letter was preserved in the place that I found it because President Grant sent it to the president of California Mission with instructions that the next time he went to Oakland, he should talk to this woman. Her name was Marie Graves. Should talk to her and let her know that if there ever got to be as many blacks in Oakland as there were in Atlanta, there would be lines drawn there too. I don't know how she felt if she was ever told that, but I can tell you it did not affect her behavior. She continued to go to church. I find her in the minutes of the Relief Society constantly giving donations from her wages as a dressmaker. She and her husband both bore their testimony regularly. Sometimes she would ask the congregation to join a hymn, sing a hymn with her to express her testimony. Her husband was asked to close the meeting with prayer a number of times. She stayed faithful until she died in 1930, and he was faithful until his death in 1940. When I told that story, I at first did not tell the part about President Grant notifying the mission president that there would be a color line drawn in California as well, because I wanted people to focus on what the Graves couple had done as faithful Latter-day Saints before the indignation of how dare this racism be this bad. I eventually did tell the whole story. But the people in Oakland, California today adopted the Graves as their pioneering African-American couple. They discovered pretty quickly that although Marie had a gravestone, William's name had never been added to it. And so they raised the money to put up a monument to both of them, identifying them as their pioneering Black saints and some details about their lives. And a few years ago, Paul Reeve and I flew down and took part in the dedication of that grave marker. This past month for Martin Luther King celebration, the Oakland Lord again put on an event that featured the graves. These people have meant so much to them. Just learning about who their spiritual ancestors are, that it has lasted. It wasn't just a good story for an evening. It has lasted and made a difference ongoing. You might wonder where some of these news stories come from. The story about the graves started when I was going through boxes of records having to do with the California mission, just turning one page after another in files, and most of the materials were about fundraising to build new chapels, or we need new missionaries by February to replace these 6 who are going home. And so it was all very routine business. And then I turned the page, and there was a letter that was handwritten. It was written by someone who was obviously not very comfortable holding a pen, but that sets all my senses off. This is a personal thing, and I started to read it. It was Marie Graves' letter, and it was so filled with faith that I had to find out more. And that's where I started reading the minutes of the Relief Society and checking into civil records, reading what Armin Moss had to say. Armin Moss has been our great sociologist in the church. He died a year or 2 ago. But when he was a boy, he knew William Graves. He was 12 when William died, and so the memories he had were the ones that a child would have. But everything he remembered fit with things that I had learned about the Graves from other records. So that is the kind of thing that you just do. Most of the time, you cannot say, I am going to find a story today. In fact, if you hired me to find a good story about your great-grandfather, I'd probably have to decline because you can't go out and hunt for these things expecting to find them by any sort of schedule. Most of the things that I have found have been almost by accident. Not entirely, because I don't believe in accidents when it comes to people wanting to have their stories told and being remembered, but they're things that I couldn't have found myself. For example, I put on a reel of microfilm of the Beaver newspaper, and the date that I needed was near the end, so I'm cranking, and I needed to give my hand a rest, so I stopped for just a moment, and out of the corner of my eye, there was an article, a line jumped out at me, it said, raised in the family of Brigham Young. Well, I had been trying to build a complete database of Brigham Young's descendants, and so I looked at it, and what I saw was the claim that a young woman had become a prostitute and had committed suicide in a brothel in Butte, Montana. And she had been raised, according to this article, in the household of Brigham Young. And thus we see the sad fate of women who fall into the clutches of, you can imagine the kinds of stories, lines that you find in stories like that. Well, that was a challenge. I'd never heard of this girl, and I had to find out. It's true, although that's not entirely the story. Ina married Indiana. She went by Ina as a child. Indiana Mary Maybert was born in Calcutta, India. And she was brought to Utah in 1863 by her grandmother when Ina was 2 years old. The grandmother soon died, and the toddler was raised by Lucy Bigelow Young, who was one of Brigham Young's wives, in Salt Lake, and then again, they moved out to St. George. She apparently never became reconciled to, it's not like she remembered her life before, but she clearly did not fit in to life in St. George. She did not carry the Young name, although some other foster children in various Young families were called Young. She is clearly different. She's East Indian, she's a biracial child, and she just didn't fit in. When she was almost 16, she wrote a letter to her family back in Calcutta asking if she could come home. And they were thrilled to hear from her, and they promised to send the money, and she could come home. She just had to get to the seashore and climb on a ship, and they would welcome her with open arms. Well, one of her uncles in India wrote to a Protestant minister in Salt Lake and asked for his help. And when he was down in southern Utah, he discovered that Ina had taken a job in the mining camp of Silver Reef. She's out of the protection of her family, and he talks her into coming to Salt Lake in his care. Now, maybe he had her best interests at heart, I don't know, but he didn't get her foster family's permission, and she just took off for Salt Lake. He did not make arrangements for her to go back to Calcutta. Her family did not send money for her. When the minister's wife went back east for an extended vacation, they decided that Ina should not stay alone in the home with the minister. And so it was up to her to find somewhere else to stay. She could have gone back to the Young family. I have no doubt of that from some of the correspondence that I've read. But instead of that, the next appearance on the record is a 4th of July parade where she is riding in an open carriage with women of one of the local brothels. I find her in police records. She is arrested a couple of times, serves jail sentences and so on. And at one point she goes up to Butte and she overdoses on laudanum, and she had just barely turned 18 years old. When I told that story in a Tribune column, for the entire weekend, it was the highest read, or at least opened, story on the Tribune website. And then on Sunday evening, the webmaster changed the headline a little bit, and he took the word prostitute out of the headline, and I don't think it got another hit. That illustrates the kind of life this poor girl had once she left her family and entered that world. Everybody was interested in the racy side of her life, but nobody seems to remember that she was just a young girl who got into trouble and needed help and didn't get it. It served one purpose, though. That column was picked up by a news aggregator that picks up every story it can find having to do with India and then distributes it to Indians around the world. And it reached a man in Australia who recognized the names as members of his family, and he went through his papers and he found a photograph of Ina's mother with her parents' names both written on the back, so it's no doubt that it's the same girl. And we now have the picture of Ina's mother was a Latter-day Saint in Calcutta, India in the 1850s. Don't know a lot about her life. She died quite young. But we find these stories in the weirdest ways. Just that line in the corner of my eye that jumped out. Herta Clara Kulik's story came up because of two lines in a history of the Sunday school published in the Juvenile Instructor magazine. Every other history of the Sunday school that I have read gives credit to those three general authorities for starting a Sunday school and beginning to find converts. That two little lines that didn't even mention Herta's name just said that a teenage girl invited her friends to come. Well, she's the only teenage girl in the church in Buenos Aires, so she was pretty easy to identify. But it's just those two little lines. If I could share my screen, I would show you a story that I'm working on right now. I've been transcribing all the incoming correspondence to John Taylor for the 1870s and 80s. There's an astonishing number of letters from people saying, hey, I want to join your people. Just send me train fare and I'll be right there. Or sometimes just send me boat fare across the Atlantic and I'll come and join. And it's so obvious that they're hoping just for a handout and you'll never see them again. I read this letter in 1878 from a woman in Michigan who was asking for help coming to Utah. But there's something different about the letter. You can tell that she really knows something about the church. And so I decided a couple of weeks ago, I wanted to know, did she ever make it to Utah? And I looked her up in the 1880 census. She's still in Michigan, but I about fell off my chair when I noticed something about that census. Her race is marked M, mulatto. I discovered 2 families of Black Latter-day Saints in 1878 in Michigan that I'm now researching. I even have a photograph of this woman who wrote the letter. But it would have been so easy to just skip by, say, oh, this is just another one of those letters, people looking for money. But I made that effort just to answer that one question: did she ever make it to Utah? And now, before I'm through with it, I'm going to know everything that the records have to say about Samantha Cummings of Michigan. Another way that I find these stories, before the Utah War in 1855-56, John Taylor published a newspaper in New York City called The Mormon. And as the war is getting closer and it's clear that the army is going to be marching on Utah, he closes down that newspaper. The very last issue, the very last bit of editorial content, there's some ads that come after, but the last column of editorial content, the last item in that column is an excerpt from a letter that John Taylor received from someone who was crossing the plains and wrote back to New York to say, we stopped and we saw grave markers of this person, that person, and this other person. I always, when I see something about a pioneer in an unusual place, I always look to see if they're on that list that the church has been building for years now. It used to be called the Overland Travel Database, and now is part of the LDS Biographical Database. Everybody that was mentioned in that letter was already on the database, except one, a 2-year-old child whose family had started out, well, in her lifetime. Her family had immigrated earlier to Utah, and then her father went back as a missionary, and her mother, his wife and children went with them, and this is their second return travel to Utah. His 2-year-old baby sickened and died, and a little bit of research showed that she had been pretty well forgotten by her family. They had her name was Emeretta, and there were a few things on Family Search about Loretta ? Or Energetta, or just all these variations. They'd forgotten who she was. They had no idea what had happened to her, and I was able from that to identify this child again. I just don't think anybody should be forgotten that way. And then the remarkable thing is, while they were back in the East, before they headed back to Utah, they had a photograph made of the mother holding this child. We have a picture of a baby who died on the plains in the 1850s, headed to Utah. I don't know if you realize how vanishingly rare that is, but I was able to identify that child through the research that I was doing. It just makes them seem so real, and they haven't been forgotten. I'm going to have to skip a couple of stories, which you won't mind so much. I just want to finish up with one story that shows that some of these stories can be used to make gospel points. They're not just pleasant reading for an afternoon, but they can actually be used in teaching without preaching and without rubbing in the moral of the story. This was a story about a boy named Hagab Gregor Manassian. He was an Armenian who was born in a town on the eastern edge of Turkey. He was 9 years old when the genocide started. He later wrote a reminiscence where he tells some of the terrible things that he saw. He saw a Turk split his aunt's head open with an axe. He saw his father shot. His mother disappeared. He saw his 2-year-old sister thrown into a pit, and he never knew whether she was alive or dead before she was thrown in. And he never forgot the things that he saw, and he ran the way they do all during the genocide. He lived by himself, by his own wits, just a child. When he was with Turks, he spoke Turkish. When he was with the Kurds, he spoke Kurdish. He even at one point was among an Arab group, and he spoke Arab. He was a whiz at languages. He did whatever it took to fit in and to survive. When the end of the war came, he was on the extreme west end of Turkey, but he made his way back to his hometown, and everybody he knew was gone. His father's vineyards were gone. He could find no relatives. He became ill and was taken to the hospital, and that may have been the best thing that could have happened, because he was recognized there by a man who had once been an employee of his father. And that man told him that he had heard from the boy's uncle in Switzerland, who had written to find out whether he still had any family left or not. And that boy was able to go to Switzerland to be with his uncle. He, in effect, had a second chance at having family. He went to school, he worked, and as a sign of gratitude to his uncle, everything that he made, he turned over to his uncle's family. He became a pastry maker and a candy maker. One of the people that he met while he was in Basel was another candy maker named Bodwagan Peranian, which sets off all kinds of bells for me, because I knew that later on he went back to Syria to become president of the Armenian mission there. Bodwagan Peranian took Haga to a church meeting. It happened to be Mother's Day, and he just fell in love with the church. He continued to study and to go to church regularly, and he was baptized. And at that point, his family threw him out. He lost his family a second time because he had become a member of the church, and they were very much opposed to that. Well, he stayed with the church. He married and then baptized his wife. He married a Swiss girl. And in 1932, he goes to a district conference, and the speaker that week was John Witzel, who was president of the European mission, who was making a tour, and he spoke about temples and about family history work and about sealing ordinances. And it was the first time that Haga had ever heard any of that. And he realized that he could have a chance of having his family again, this time for eternity. He had no way of finding records. He tried to reconstruct as best as he could the names of those relatives he could remember and their approximate ages based on what he could remember. And it's still going to be more than 20 years before the temple is built in Switzerland. But he, with his wife's help, outlined what they could find and remember about his family. And when the Swiss temple was opened, he went and had the sealing ordinances done, and he finally has his family back. Unfortunately, for someone like me, I can't get to his record in Family Search because he was born in a Muslim country. It's all blocked out. But I can tell from clues of other work that has been done that his family in Switzerland, his descendants, are still members of the church and still actively attending to temple work. Now, I just told that pretty straightforward. I don't like stories where you really have to I don't like telling things with a great deal of extra emotion where, did you catch that? Are you really moved by the way the Spirit works in this circumstance? I believe in just telling the stories and letting them move you if you share that experience. But that's an example of how one of these news stories carries with it a gospel message that wouldn't be very difficult to use in a lesson or a church talk. And I'm always thrilled when I hear from people who have done just that. I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker. I post these things on my blog for people to find and use, and I would be more pleased than you would know if sometime you were to tell me that I used this story in my Relief Society lesson or to teach the young men or something. That's what I do all the time, day in and day out. I'm usually at my desk by 4 o'clock in the morning transcribing, and other than housework, that's all I do all day long till about 10 o'clock at night. And I just love us. What can I say? This is who we are. And I love the record that we have that I'm determined to help bring back. That's what I had planned, and I would be delighted if you had any questions or comments, or have you run into any story from this part of the world or whatever. I'm here.
Ardis, wonderful. You're a great storyteller. Incredible. Let me ask you if you'll tell us one more story, and that's the one that brought you to my attention. The one that you wrote most recently about, if I've got the name right, Nancy Hudson. Is that right?
Jane Hunter.
Jane Hunter. Yeah, sorry. Not waiting close.
Okay.
But will you tell that story?
Be happy to. Jane Hunter was a woman born in the north end of London. She joined the church in 1851. We know that she was a faithful member of the church because in 1854, when the saints in her branch wanted to go to Utah, she wanted to come along with them. And so they showed up at we know she was faithful because the church had offered to send her to Utah using the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, which was only used for people who were faithful and they believed would make a contribution to the society here. So they get to the dock and they go aboard ship, but they have to wait a couple of days because it wasn't quite time to sail. Just before they sail, everyone is lined up on the deck and the ship's officers inspect. The doctor comes to sees Jane, and he tells her that she can't sail with him. She can't go with him. The immigration that year was going in through the port of New Orleans, and Jane Hunter was a black woman, and he knew that she would be taken into slavery as soon as they arrived in Louisiana, and also that the ship's officers would be likely arrested for violating the law then in effect against importing slaves. And so she was put back on the dock, would have to find her own way to Utah. She boarded a ship that was headed to Canada, presumably was going to be safe from slavery that way. But she also had to go alone without a returning missionary who understood how these things worked. When she got to Montreal, she would have to support herself until she could make her way west. I've hunted her, and I haven't given up yet, but I know she never made it to Utah. But I'm looking for some trace of her in Canada. I'd like to know that she at least made it safely there. But she's an example of the kind of faithfulness that we find so often with these people in our Century of Black Mormons database. She could have gone back to London. She was a laundress. Her work could have supported her the next year the way it had the previous year. But she was so determined to get to Utah. At least I'm convinced that there was that determination that made her get aboard that other ship. The way that I even knew to investigate her as a Black Latter-day Saint, because the church has never tracked race of any, there's no form that calls for race. It never has been. There are a lot of ward clerks who can't help but write Negro next to somebody's name in a ward membership record, but the record doesn't call for that. But as she was standing on deck, another passenger overheard the conversation and understood why she wasn't being allowed to go to the United States. And he wrote 4 lines in his diary that came to my attention. He even got her name wrong, but it was close enough that I could identify her. It's that kind of very small chance that preserves these stories. There was a question or a remark someone wanted me to tell you about my project to identify and memorialize the Latter-day Saints who died as a result of the flu pandemic in 1918 through 1920. It's an ongoing project, but that's one of the ways that I coped with being in COVID lockdown in the beginning, was to go back to an earlier pandemic where records are now available. There aren't records yet available publicly for me to identify Latter-day Saints in the COVID epidemic. but I could identify, and I was tweeting then, so they're just tweet length biographies. I've identified something like 2,500 Latter-day Saints who died as the direct result of the flu or the pneumonia that followed. And those are almost exclusively in Utah because I have access to, I can cross-reference the death certificates with the family search to find people who are both Latter-day Saints and died of the flu. I can't do that outside of the Mormon corridor. I mean, you can imagine how many people there are in Ohio who died of the flu, and I can't very well look up each one of those to see if they might have been LDS or not. There is a way that I can solve that problem once I can spend a lot of time back in the family history library, and I intend to do that. But there's just something about being able to recall people by name. Just something about them. She was a missionary when she died. He was a father. This was a child. There were at least 3 members of the Tabernacle Choir that I identified. It's just, there's just something special about remembering. Those memorials are all posted on my blog under the rubric Who We Lost. You can use the search bar, and there's one post that just lists them all with links to their individual biographies.
You see the question by Gary London that there as well?
I do. It's about the minutes and that we no longer keep, that we used to keep, and I think it's a tragedy. I really do. At one point in the 70s, they decided that they no longer needed to keep a lot of the records that we used to keep. And I'm sad about that because that's how we learn so much about the individual members of the church. They don't ask me, and so I wasn't able to weigh in with my opinion, but I understand the amount of work that goes into preserving those, the amount of space that it takes to store the minute books and so on. But is there any way to compensate for that loss? I think we have more records available than ever before for tracking people's lives, the actual movements and dates and places and so on. But I don't know anything that replaces the personal touch. The record that some elders quorum minute taker made of a testimony that was born, or the compassionate service that was rendered by a Relief Society where your great-grandmother's name is mentioned, or the mutual plays that were put on where your uncle was had a starring role. I don't know how we replace that, except that so much depends. If you want your descendants or others who are interested to know about those activities in your life, you're the one who has to record that. And you can add it to the memories pages on Family Search. You can put it in a family newsletter. But that's the only way I know to compensate for that, is each person taking responsibility for documenting their own lives or their parents or any others that they feel responsible for. It really is a shame that those records went away, because I've answered so many questions about the people that I'm searching for, what their lives in the church were actually like. I mean, how else would you know that Marie Graves was so generous that she gave $1 to the Relief Society charity fund one week when nobody else in the branch gave more than 25 cents? I mean, that's a little thing, but when you add lots of little things together, you get a picture of a life. And I will probably just keep on rattling unless someone interrupts with a better question.
Matt Harris notes, he says, "Thank you for your presentation, Ardis. I enjoyed it very much. Do you know if Paul Reeve has plans to extend the Century of Mormon's database beyond 1930? Thanks for your contributions to this valuable work as well."
We are preserving information that we find for more recent generations. But right now we're still focusing on that first century because there are so many that have not yet been found or that we have not yet fully researched. Every once in a while, there's one of the genealogy classes at BYU will tackle one of our people and help to do the research. And that's a great boon to have somebody who's willing to donate time that way. But there are so many still to be found. We had no clue about this colony of Black Latter-day Saints in Michigan until I just looked them up on the census that day. So how many more are we going to find? We find them in unusual ways. At least I wish that some of it were more unusual than it is. One of the surest ways to know that there are Black Latter-day Saints in a given place is to watch for signs of racism in the records. When a local church leader complains that there are too many black faces in the congregation, that the investigators won't come, well, there are some black faces to find. We have gone through every name in records for a place that where something like that has been said, cross-referencing every church member against the nearest census, because the church membership establishes that they were LDS. The census can tell us what the race was, and we have found people by doing that. We've also scanned entire rolls of church census, just one name after another, looking for those remarks where a ward clerk just could not resist noting that someone was black. And that tends to be how we find once we get away from Utah with the formerly enslaved people that were known to be members of the church. That's how we have to find these people, one at a time. One thing that is kind of interesting about this lady that I found in Michigan, we know that she remained with the church because her ordinance dates show that in 1917, this is 40 years after we know she was baptized, she came to Salt Lake City passing as white and went through the Salt Lake Temple. So she's still active in the church at that point. Anyway.
Let me ask you about what about Native Americans who joined the church early on? Do you have any insights into that situation?
There aren't as many that we can research and tell the stories of as I would wish, because so often, if we're talking 19th century Native American baptisms, they didn't treat those baptisms the same way they treated your grandfather when he was baptized. They may have made a list of names, but there's no way to research those people individually. And sometimes they didn't even record their names. They gave them names like Nephi and Abinadi and so on. And so we don't know even what their real names were. I do find some in the early 20th century, once they begin to show up in the same kinds of records that white settlers appear in, but they are so hard to research. They really are. I mean, I haven't found a way. Maybe someone else at some point will have a brilliant idea, but that hasn't been me so far.
Great.
When I was researching those who died in the flu pandemic, I did find a number of unexpected, some Japanese converts in Utah, and I did find one man that I knew was LDS. Actually, he was the first Native missionary, quite a prominent man. He taught at Utah State Agricultural College, Utah Agricultural College even. And he was a grandson of Sagwitch, the Indian chief. So, but he's a special case because he was in the records individually from the beginning of his life because of who he was related to. But others, I just don't know.
Bill Gould makes a comment. You see his?
Um, Easiest way, wants to know how he could be sure I have their names for the project, is just send me an email identifying them and how you know that they died of the flu. Whether there are so many stories where people assume that because someone died in 1918 it must have been of the flu, that I try to find something definite, either a death certificate or a story. The obituary might mention something. But just send me an email, and that's all I need to be alerted. I can send you a link to the biography if I've already done one, and if I haven't, I'll get busy and do it.
Well, Ardis, you are a treasure. Thank you so much for spending a delightful evening with us. We have Matt Harris here with us. We won't have a fireside next week because we have a state conference here in our area. But our next fireside will be on Saturday, February 18th with Matt Harris, I'm delighted to say. Matt has given us a couple firesides before. He's professor of history and director of legal studies program at Colorado State University in Pueblo. He previously spoke about Ezra Taft Benson, and he also spoke about the long-awaited day, the book, which maybe you can tell us, Matt, how soon can we buy a copy of the long-awaited day? He wrote an interesting article, fascinating article, I would say, in Dialogue recently about entitled Joseph Fielding Smith's Evolving Views on Race, the Odyssey of a Mormon Apostle Prophet. So what can you tell us about your book, Matt? When can we expect to buy a copy?
Boy, I wish I could say go buy one right now, but the truth is it won't be out until early 2024. It's in production now. So it takes a while. Once you finish the manuscript, it takes at least a year to get it through to print. So that's where we're at. I wish it was done, but it's not quite there yet.
I'm not sure who wrote this, but I picked up off your, probably out of Wikipedia or someplace, I picked this up. It says, an overview of your Dialogue article is the following. Let me read it. The apostle had authored several books defending the ban, the priesthood ban, and he was the church's most aggressive leader condemning Mormon intellectuals who criticized it. Smith saw himself as a guardian of Mormon orthodoxy, not just on matters of race and lineage, but also on issues like evolution and doctrinal exegesis. Yet over the course of Smith's long ministry, and especially during the last decade of his life, he began to envision a more inclusive LDS church for persons of African ancestry. He took dramatic steps to both convert and retain Black Latter-day Saints. It was less a change in how Smith read Scripture and more about the turbulent times in which he lived. The civil rights movement, and more critically, Smith's own awareness of how the priesthood and temple ban affected Black members, convinced him to reimagine a place for them within the church. Wow, what an interesting insight. Can you tell us any more tease us a little bit with what you're going to say 2 weeks from now?
Well, I think what I want to do is talk about how it's really important to get good source material. Artists could really appreciate this. Is that once you get good source material, you begin to see a different side of somebody that typically, say, Latter-day Saints don't see. So, for example, I've read his diaries. I've read many of his letters. I've read you just get another dimension of him. And so one of the things I want to share within a couple of weeks is a little bit about his sense of humor that Saints don't usually see. They see him as sort of the stern, doctrinaire person. I also want to share, which is what you asked me to do, is to share some of the insights from this article, which is that how he evolved throughout the course of his church ministry. And I think most probably people on this Zoom call today know him as this really inflexible, hardcore, doctrinaire thinker when it came to the priesthood ban. But and that's probably, there's truth to it, but he certainly, toward the latter part of his life, he mellows. And I also think that less known, and I'll talk about this in 2 weeks, is that Joseph Fielding Smith was the brainchild behind the origins of the Genesis group, which is astonishing that some of his biographers haven't even talked about that. So I think that evolution is sort of emblematic of how he evolved towards the ban and how he began to envision a church that ought to include more Black Latter-day Saints. He was very sensitive to their needs and reaching out to them.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to that. I can also just tease you a little bit as well that we will hear from Alice Faulkner Birch here in a couple of weeks, who's just edited a marvelous book. Let's see, what is it titled? Let's see. Oh, My Lord, He Calls Me, Stories of Faith by Black Latter-day Saints. It's a new book which combines historical stories with contemporary teachings about the scriptures, for which she calls Jehovah's plan for unification of all peoples and why becoming united is critical. So look forward to that as well. It's a topic that we're going to spend considerably more time on in the future. Thanks again, Ardis, for a delightful evening. Look forward to seeing you not next week, but the week after that. Suzanne Carnegie, could I ask you to give us a benediction, assuming you're here and available? Rebecca?
Yes, thanks, Bishop. Thank you.
You bet.
Our Father in heaven, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. You bet.
Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful this evening to have gathered here through wonderful technology to listen to Sister Parshall. What a treasure, as Bishop Bounty has called her, with her storytelling and her interest in people, her love for people. We can certainly see that with her stories. We're so grateful for thy Son, Jesus Christ, Heavenly Father, and his sacrifice for us. We're grateful for families and everything that the church provides for us. Please bless us as we move into fast and testimony meeting tomorrow, that we can feel thy spirit and be edified with our meetings. And again, we're thankful to Sister Parshall, and we say this in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Delighted to have you all here. And thank you again, Ardis, for a wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank you, Ardis. Wonderful.
Yes. Wish you all a good Sabbath. Ardis, if you'll stay on board just a second after everyone else shoots up, I've got a couple things I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you, Ardis. That was wonderful.